when you compare Revelations 20 with Daniel 12, this is what happens, okay? In Revelations 20, the context here is after the situation with the Antichrist, okay? Those that did not worship, there were people being beheaded, okay? Because of the testimony of Jesus. It says here, and I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God. Okay? And it says, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads, or in their hands, and they lived with and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again, until the 1,000 years were finished. So we've got a positive outcome of beheaded saints. They rise to everlasting life, okay, which is a positive outcome. So they get to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. And then we have the rest of the dead, another group of people that are also dead. They did not get to live again, so they have a negative outcome. You parallel this with Daniel 12. We have a time of trouble. This has to be after the Antichrist. Thy people shall be delivered, every one that should be found written in the book. So these are people that are still alive on earth. And then it says, but in verse 2 it says, and many of them that sleep in the dust. Okay, these are people that are dead. So you have two groups of people that are dead here. Sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life. Okay, so this is one group of people. They get a positive outcome, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So they have a negative outcome, just like in Revelations 20. See, this is not to do with the rapture, you see, of the saints, because the rapture happens before the Antichrist, you see, before he brings the mark of the beast and all that. Yeah, and to do with the Antichrist, well, to do with the first resurrection has two positive outcomes, right? Whereas in these situations with Daniel 12 and Revelations 20 has a positive outcome, but also a negative outcome as well. So when you go to 1 Thessalonians 4, you have two positive outcomes before the Antichrist situation happens. You have one, which is the dead people rising to meet Jesus in the clouds, and then those that are alive, that are still alive on earth, that are Christians, they rise up into the clouds also. So you have two positive outcomes. But Daniel 12 and Revelations 20 has one positive outcome and one negative outcome. So this proves to me that Daniel 12, that the time of trouble happens after the situation with the Antichrist, when God's judgment is coming to the earth. Now we're going to look at Luke 21. Now in Luke 21, right, this is very important, right? Jesus is saying that he said unto them, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. Okay, so this is the form of time of trouble. And then when you go to verse 12, this is to do with, I had figured out that this is to do with the great tribulation of the saints. Okay, and it's because synagogues is mentioned here. Okay, you know, it says, now look at what it says in verse 12. It says, but before all these, that means before the nations and the kingdoms against kingdoms, and the famines and the pestilences and the earthquakes, before that happens, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Okay, so this is the great tribulation of the saints in this verse 12. So the time of trouble happens after the happens after the great tribulation of the saints. Okay, so these paragraphs are obviously in different positions from each other, but when you go to Matthew 24, they have the word then being used, which makes...
This is after 3.5 years has expired. The time of trouble in verse 1 is not the tribulation of the saints, and I will actually explain this. So what we have to do is that we have to learn to understand Daniel 12, the time of trouble, and I don't believe it's the great tribulation of the saints. Next slide. So this is to help us to get a bigger picture with more data. So in Luke 21 verse 10 it says, Then said he, Jesus, unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. So when we go to verse 12, but it says here, But before all these, they shall lay their hands on you, and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. And it shall turn to you for a testimony. Now this here is very interesting, because I'm convinced that this is definitely talking about the tribulation of the saints. Because in verse 12 it says synagogues is being used here in the language, which is a Jewish house of worship. Synagogues are basically against Jesus and the saints, as we find here. The Antichrist, remember, is in the temple of God and is blaspheming God's name, influences synagogues. I mean, I don't think just now that there's Jews taking Christians into synagogues just now and persecuting them. You know, we don't have anything like that. So this has to be because the Antichrist is showing himself as God in the temple of God. And then what we find is that after that, then comes the wars, famines, the time of trouble mentioned in Daniel 12. And the fearful sights will be for the evil nations, and fearful sights are coming from the sky, scaring the evil nations, which you can read about in Revelation 6, about the people saying, oh, we want the rocks to fall on us to hide us from him that sits on the throne. So that's what the situation in the chronological order there. So we'll go to Matthew, verse 24. We're going to be learning about this, analysing what this time of trouble is. It says here, For a nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So what we find in the tribulation of the saints is that, Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Now you'll notice the word then, because then makes it seem like as if it's after the wars and famines, etc., which would actually contradict Luke 21, but I'm going to clear up the confusion here. Because if we go to the next slide, because we'll get back to that scripture. We usually use the word then for what happens next after the previous sentence. For example, this happened and then that happened. But the word then in the Bible can actually be used a bit different from the way we would normally use it in our English grammar. So what we find is, to find evidence of this, you'll find it in Matthew chapter 2, verse 14. And it says here, we read, When he, Joseph, arose, he took the young child, so this is Jesus when he was a child, and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Now this is the part that's going to be very interesting. So we're talking about something happening in the future of King Herod. Then it says in verse 16, as it continues, it says, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and set forth, and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem. So what we find here in verses 15 and 16 is that the sentences are actually of different time periods from each other. Herod is mentioned as being dead in the future, but then in verse 15, he's all of a sudden alive. You know? So the word then in verse 16 is not, of course, about what happens after the death of Herod, because that just wouldn't make any sense. We need to understand that the word then is not always what has happened in the previous sentence. And I'll show you how to read this when we read this in Matthew chapter 24 to help clear up the confusion. So we learn here is that for nation shall arise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and great earthquakes in diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver, so then is a different time period from what's been mentioned there, if you read it. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all men, of all nations, for my name's sake. So this, if you were to read it like as if it's something happening after the famines and stuff, then it would contradict Luke 21, because Luke 21, verse 8 and verse 9 are of different time periods from each other. So this cannot be talking about what happens after the wars, the famines, etc. Otherwise it would just contradict Luke 21 before all of these. So it's actually quite a tricky verse here. And also you'll find, anyway, in Mark 13 verse 9, after mentioning wars, famines, etc., we read, "But take heed to yourselves, for they shall deliver you up to councils." So what we find here is that Mark 13, it does not tell you the affliction happens after the wars and famines either. It gives no indication of what happens after the wars and famines. And I'll see in the next slide. We're going to look at what happens before the Great Tribulation of the saints. Luke 21, verse 20. "And when ye shall see the Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation is nigh." Verse 21. "And let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains." So this is them getting ready for the tribulation happening. So this is likely the Antichrist army in Jerusalem. It is a sign the tribulation is close, desolation is near, and Jesus is telling them that they need to flee to the mountains, the left behind saints, because the tribulation of the saints is about to start. Go to the next slide now. Matthew 24, verse 15. And it says here, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, stand in the holy place," so that's when they're taking the daily sacrifice away, "then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." So what we find here is that we have the abomination of desolation being set up in the holy place, which is likely the third temple in Jerusalem, and this marks the beginning of the tribulation for 3.5 years. And then of course the saints, they need to flee the mountains, Jesus tells them, and the days are shortened to 3.5 years for the elect's sake. So the days are shortened to help deliver the saints from the grasp of the Antichrist. So we're just going to look at